Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. My name is Martin Tobal, and today I will talk about the Argentine crisis of 2001. Because I work at Banco de Mexico, it is important that I tell you that the usual disclaimer applies. But even before talking about any sort of crisis, let me start from where we economists would call the very beginning, GDP per capita. GDP per capita is an indicator that we economists use to measure the economic development of a country and its economic performance. So that if we look at the GDP per capita of Argentina, we see that from 1960 to 2019, that hasn't grown that much. But that becomes even clearer as we look at the GDP per capita of other Latin American economies. And we see that those economies perform much better than Argentina over those 60-year periods of time. Or to put it differently, GDP of Argentina relative to that of other Latin American economies diminished consistently from 1960 to 2019. Today we will focus on the economic crash of Argentina of 2001. But to understand this crash, it is important to know that even before 2001, Argentina had already gone through several currency crises, an hyperinflation episode that had already reduced the confidence in Argentina even before 2001. Jumping into the second section, the chronology of the crisis, let me start by telling you that two of those hyperinflation episodes took place in 1989 and 1991, and therefore at the time President Carlos Menem and his Minister of Economics, Domingo Cavallo, adopted the convertibility plan to put inflation under control. The plan set the Argentinian exchange rate of 1 Argentine peso at 1 Argentine peso per unit of US dollar. So that to implement that exchange rate regime, the Central Bank of Argentina was restricted to supply one monetary unit, 1 Argentine peso, per unit of US dollar that was available or that was supplied in Argentina at the time. Let me show you what this means in a very simple diagram, supply and demand diagram. This is where the equilibrium stands, where $1 is exchanged for 1 Argentine peso. But one implication of this system is that, for example, when there is lower confidence in Argentina, foreigners' investments in Argentina fall. That reduces the supply of US dollars in Argentina, and this in turn forces the Central Bank of Argentina to reduce also the supply of Argentine pesos. That is what we economists call a contractionary monetary policy. So when there is a reduction in the supply of US dollars in Argentina, that also triggers contractionary effects on economic activity, and therefore it increases the unemployment rate. To put it differently, the exchange rate system adopted by Argentina in 1991 required the continuous inflows of US dollar into the Argentine economy. An additional feature is that because the money supply in Argentina was constrained, the government couldn't use it to finance its fiscal deficit. Instead, the Argentine government, if it ran fiscal deficit, it has to finance it with borrowing through issuing debt, and therefore that required that the Argentine government keep investor confidence in Argentina at high levels. The implementation of that exchange rate regime came along with the implementation of free market reforms that increased confidence and brought dollars into Argentina during the first years of the implementation, and there were also privatizations of state-owned companies that brought even more dollars into the country. Thus, that inflow of US dollars helped maintain the fixed exchange rate regime, and that in turn made it very clear for Argentinians what the future path of money supply in Argentina was going to be. It anchored expectation about future money supply. It also then anchored expectation about inflation, and in turn brought the inflation rate down very quickly in Argentina. In an environment of lower inflation and economic stability, there was also a significant increase in the economic growth. So things were actually very well during the first years of the plan implementation, until the 1994-1985 Mexican crisis arrived, and then the Argentinian economy started to show some signs of weakness. The Mexican crisis increased global uncertainty, therefore it increased the demand for US dollar around the world. It reduced, as a result, the supply of US dollars in Argentina, leading to an appreciation of the US dollar. In this context, because the Argentine peso was linked to the US dollar, the appreciation of the North American currency, creating an appreciation of the Argentine peso automatically, Argentine products become less competitive, Argentine export diminish, and that is in turn reduced the supply of US dollars in Argentina by even more. So what was the solution to that? Well, because the nominal exchange rate, the Argentine peso, was linked to the US dollar, there could have been a reduction in domestic prices that would have restored the competitiveness of Argentine products. Nonetheless, that reduction in domestic prices required an economic contraction and an increase in the employment rate. And that is precisely what we see in this graph. The increase in the unemployment rate become even more pronounced in Argentina after the Mexican crisis. What we see in this graph is actually the real sector in Argentina increasing the employment rate so that the domestic prices would fall, make the Argentine products more competitive, so that the equilibrium could be restored. Also, another sign of weakness after the Mexican crisis was that the Argentine government had been running fiscal deficit, but to finance those fiscal deficit, the Argentine government had to keep confidence in the Argentine economy, investor confidence, at a high level, and that was actually very demanding. So in a context of signs of weakness in the economy and rising increases in the unemployment rate, President de la Rúa from a different political party won the elections of 1999, and he and his Minister of Economy, Machinea, thought that the main weakness of the Argentine economy was precisely fiscal deficit, and therefore they tried to cut public expenditure. Nonetheless, that took place in a context of increasing unemployment and high social unrest, so that the attempt to cut public expenditure led to wide-scale protests, which, along with the fact that the political base in the La Rua's party was fragmented, made it very clearly that the government lacked political support precisely to cut public expenditures. Therefore, the La Rúa Machinea were unable to generate fiscal surplus to pay the debt, and Machinea was forced to resign. Instead, a new Minister of Economy, López Murphy, was appointed, but he tried with the same strategy as Machinea. He tried to cut public expenditures. But again, he lacked political support, and he couldn't create fiscal surplus, and he was also forced to resign, so that a new Minister of Economic, Cavallo, the same person who had put the convertibility plan in place in 1991, was appointed. Cavallo tried with a different strategy. He tried to create fiscal surplus, not by cutting public expenditure, but instead by increasing fiscal revenue through an increase in economic growth. But his plan failed, and that rose concerns about the low availability of US dollars in the US economy, and therefore it created doubts about banks' ability to repay um, US dollar deposits to Argentine depositors. That instead created signs, in that context, the first signs of bank run started to emerge because people started to run to the banks and withdraw their deposits. In response, the government imposed restrictions on cash withdrawal from banks. That was the policy very well known as the corralito, because the money from Argentine depositors was enclosed in the banking system. They were not able to withdraw it. But that generated even more social unrest, looting and violence, and ended up at the end of 2001 forcing De La Rua and his cabinet to resign. At the same time, to address the concerns about low availability of US dollars, Argentina signed a program with the IMF which committed to provide US dollars to Argentina. Nonetheless, that program was suspended, and Argentina ended up with its president in an environment where its president resigned and his cabinet resigned, and also went into a sovereign default. A real tragedy for Argentina, for Argentinians, and for the Argentinian economy. So now the natural question is, what created that disaster? And there were many hypotheses here. One was that the exchange rate regime that Argentina adopted in 1991 was not sufficiently flexible, because the nominal exchange rate could not actually depreciate to restore competitiveness. Instead, the US dollar appreciation after the Mexican crisis led to an appreciation of the Argentine peso after 1984 automatically. That led, as I told you earlier, to a reduction in exports and in the supplies of US dollars in Argentina that was even greater. So what could have been different was that domestic prices could have fallen to restore the competitiveness of Argentine products. Would, as I also told you earlier, require an economic contraction and an increase in the employment rate. One problem was that, of course, unemployment is bad, but also, perhaps equally important problem, is that a reduction in domestic prices takes a lot of time. And countries that adopt fixed exchange rate regimes that require a continuous inflow of US dollars into the economy, may sometimes not wait that long, and they are forced to abandon the fixed exchange rate and to devalue. A second hypothesis for the turmoil, for the economic turmoil, has to do with fiscal discipline. It is claimed sometimes that the Argentine government was not able to finance deficits with fiscal debt, with money supply. It was forced to issue debt, but no lender will lend to a borrower that never has fiscal surplus, because it is precisely those surplus that allows the country to repay the debt. So that the hypothesis here is that Argentina did not have the fiscal deficit discipline that was required in the context of a fixed exchange rate regime. And finally, a third set of hypotheses claim that it was neither a lack of flexibility in exchange rate, it was nor lack of fiscal discipline. A first set of those hypotheses point to political interest of highly indebted industrial and media groups. It is claimed, in particular, the former Minister of Economics Cavallo claims that those groups undertook an institutional coup to force devaluation and therefore conversion of their debt from dollars to pesos. And a second set of hypotheses blame the IMF. Some observers claim that the IMF was too harsh, others claim that it was too soft. But what can we conclude from all these events and the hypothesis for or potential explanation for those events? Well, Argentina actually managed to have a fixed exchange rate regime and to run fiscal deficit at the same time for a while, but that actually couldn't last very long because the Argentinian government didn't create the conditions for a more prolonged environment of trust that would have enabled the country to receive a continuous influx of dollars and continuous financing. Nonetheless, creating that environment of trust that would have lasted long was hard because Argentina had already gone through several hyperinflation episodes and currency crisis even before 2001 that had already reduced confidence in the Argentinian economy. So what do we learn? What is the main takeaway here? Same as with firms, when we talk about countries, financing that is not based on genuine economic growth, on genuine growth in the case of a firm, it may last for a while, it will never last very long, because financing must be based on genuine growth and the solid creation of trust. As that's the main takeaway. Thank you.